In the quiet English village of Narborough, a sinister shadow fell in November 1983. 15-year-old Linda Mann vanished on her way to a friend's house, only to be found brutally murdered the next day. The scene was chilling, evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. Forensics at the time offered a single clue: semen samples indicating a rare blood type and enzyme profile shared by just 10% of men. It was a scientific breadcrumb trail, but the killer remained elusive. As the investigation dragged on, fear gripped the village. Police efforts, interviews with thousands, filming mourners at Linda's funeral, and plastering posters everywhere yielded no answers. Then, 3 years later, terror struck again. 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth disappeared, her body discovered in a desolate area not far from where Linda was found. The similarities were horrifying: the same method of attack and the same forensic profile. The connection between the murders heightened the village's dread, with parents warning their daughters never to walk alone. The community was on edge, and the pressure to catch the killer was immense. A breakthrough seemed imminent when 17-year-old Richard Buckland, a local hospital worker with a troubled history, confessed to killing Dawn Ashworth. Yet he denied involvement in Linda Mann's murder, casting doubt on whether the crimes had truly been solved. Enter Dr. Alec Jeffries, a geneticist whose groundbreaking DNA profiling would make history. Using this revolutionary technique, investigators compared semen samples from both victims with Buckland's blood. The results were shocking. Not only was Buckland innocent, but the same DNA tied both murders to a single, still unknown man. For the first time in history, DNA had been used to exonerate a suspect in a murder case. The hunt for the killer took an unprecedented turn. A mass DNA screening was launched, with over 5,000 local men voluntarily submitting samples. Among them was Colin Pitchfork, but he had no intention of complying. Instead, he convinced a coworker, Ian Kelly, to pose as him and provide a sample using Pitchfork's photo. The deception might have worked, but Kelly couldn't keep the secret. A casual pub brag about the substitution reached the ears of the police. Investigators quickly closed in on Pitchfork, whose DNA was an exact match for the samples found on both victims. Confronted with the evidence, Pitchfork confessed to the murders. The repercussions were profound. Colin Pitchfork became the first person convicted of murder based on DNA evidence, marking a turning point in criminal investigations. Meanwhile, Kelly faced his own consequences, receiving a suspended sentence for his role in the conspiracy. The Narborough murders weren't just solved. They became the proving ground for a forensic revolution, forever altering how justice is pursued. In the quiet village of Narborough, England, a sense of safety had always prevailed. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and children played freely in the streets. But on a cold November evening in 1983, that illusion of security was violently shattered. 15-year-old Linda Mann, a student from the local school, was on her way to meet a friend when she vanished without a trace. Her family, frantically searching, could only wait as the hours ticked by. Then the unthinkable happened. The next morning, her body was discovered in a secluded area not far from her home. The scene was every parent's nightmare. Linda had been brutally assaulted and strangled. The investigators had little to work with, just a small piece of forensic evidence, a semen sample that would prove to be the key to the case. The sample, though, didn't offer much hope for a quick resolution. It revealed a rare blood type and enzyme profile that matched just 10% of the male population. A clue that could be pivotal, but also left the police with more questions than answers. As the village rallied together, police began a massive investigation, interviewing thousands of locals and even filming mourners at Linda's funeral in an effort to find any leads. The police issued posters, canvassed the area, and explored every avenue they could think of, but the case stalled. The killer was still out there, and the fear gripping the village grew with each passing day. Neighbors who once felt safe walking alone now hesitated, and parents kept their children close. As the investigation languished, it became clear that finding the truth would take more than just traditional methods. It would require something groundbreaking to crack the case. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Linda Mann's murder ground to a frustrating halt. Despite their best efforts, the police had little to go on. The small village of Narborough, once a close-knit community, became increasingly uneasy. The murder of a young girl had shattered its peaceful facade, and every day brought new whispers and suspicions. Investigators, hoping to catch a break, followed every lead. They interviewed thousands of people, even reaching out to strangers passing through the area, but nothing pointed to a suspect. To make matters worse, the police were forced to resort to extreme measures, filming mourners at Linda's funeral in the hopes of spotting someone acting suspiciously. They plastered posters of her face across the village, urging anyone with information to come forward, but the trail remained cold. Time passed, and the sense of urgency faded, replaced by a creeping anxiety that something far darker was lurking beneath the surface. People began to wonder, was the killer still in the village, or had he already slipped through their fingers? The police were no closer to finding answers, and the villagers, once trusting, began to fear that the killer could be anyone, their neighbors, a friend, or even a family member. Then, just when it seemed that the investigation would slip into obscurity, something even more terrifying occurred. The terror that had once loomed over Narborough resurfaced with an even darker intensity. When 3 years after Linda Mann's murder, the village was struck by another tragedy. On July 31st, 1986, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth went missing while walking to meet a friend. It was a heart-stopping deja vu. And the people of Narborough knew instantly that the nightmare they thought was behind them had returned. Dawn, like Linda before her, was a student at the local school, and her disappearance sent shockwaves through the close-knit community. Her parents, the police, and the villagers launched an immediate search, but as the hours passed with no sign of her, the town began to fear the worst. The horror reached its peak when, just days later, Dawn's body was discovered in a secluded field on the outskirts of the village, a grim, haunting echo of Linda's fate. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled in a manner identical to Linda's murder, leading investigators to wonder if the same predator had struck again. The chilling similarities between the two cases were undeniable. Both girls had vanished from the same area, both had been subjected to the same brutal attack, and both bodies were discovered in eerily similar locations. It was as if the killer had returned to the scene of the crime, confident that he could once again slip through the cracks. As the investigation unfolded, the police were confronted with the terrifying possibility that the killer was someone local, someone who knew the area intimately. The village, once a peaceful haven, was now a hotbed of suspicion. Residents began to look at each other with wariness, wondering if the person living next door could be a murderer. Fear crept into every corner of Narborough, and parents, terrified for the safety of their children, told them to stay home and travel only in groups. The once bustling streets were quieter than ever. The detectives investigating the case, already exhausted from the lingering trauma of Linda's unsolved murder, found themselves facing the possibility that they were chasing a ghost, a killer who had eluded them once and was now tormenting the entire village once again. The similarities between the two murders were not just coincidental. Forensic evidence from Dawn's body revealed semen samples with the same rare blood type enzyme profile that had been found on Linda's body, confirming that both crimes were committed by the same person. This critical link was both a breakthrough and a curse. The connection between the two murders made it clear that the killer had returned to finish what he started, but it also presented the police with a horrifying realization. They were no closer to catching him. Despite the mounting pressure, the investigation seemed to stall once more. The killer had not only evaded capture, but seemed emboldened by the lack of progress, his confidence growing with each passing day. Just when it seemed as though the investigation into the Narborough murders would slip into the dark annals of unsolved cases, a breakthrough came from the most unexpected of places: science. While traditional investigative methods had failed to provide answers, the rapidly advancing field of genetics was about to alter the course of the case, and forensic science itself forever. In 1987, Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a British geneticist, had developed a revolutionary technique: DNA profiling. At the time, the concept of using DNA to identify criminals was groundbreaking, and it was still a relatively unknown tool in criminal investigations. However, as investigators in Narborough wrestled with few leads and growing frustration, they decided to take a bold step. They sent the semen samples collected from both victims' bodies to Dr. Jeffries for analysis. What followed was a revelation that would change the entire landscape of forensic science. Jeffries' method allowed investigators to analyze the genetic markers in the semen samples found on Linda and Dawn and to compare them to potential suspects. In a stunning twist, the results were conclusive. The DNA profile found on both victims did not match that of Richard Buckland, the psychiatric hospital worker who had earlier confessed to the murder of Dawn Ashworth but had denied involvement in Linda's death. This was the first time that DNA profiling had been used to exonerate a suspect in a murder case, and it was a pivotal moment in both the investigation and the history of criminal justice. Buckland, once the prime suspect, was cleared, and the police were faced with a new reality. The killer was still out there, and they now had a scientific method that could lead them to him. The confirmation that Buckland was innocent was a relief in some ways, but it also deepened the mystery. How could the police have been so wrong? And where did this leave the investigation? With the use of DNA profiling now firmly in their arsenal, investigators prepared to re-examine every lead and consider the possibility that the killer had never been identified at all. But what was still to come would push the boundaries of forensic science even further, leading the investigation down a path no one could have predicted. With Buckland's exoneration, the investigation into the Narborough murders found itself at a crossroads. The realization that DNA evidence could not only implicate but also clear suspects pushed the police to think outside the box. They needed to catch the real killer, and the tool that would lead them to him was now in their hands. The discovery that both victims shared the same rare DNA profile meant that the police had a potential genetic marker, a trail they could follow, but it was still a daunting task. The killer, who had evaded capture for years, could be anywhere in the local area, and there were thousands of potential suspects. In what became a groundbreaking moment for both the case and forensic science, the police decided to conduct a mass DNA screening. It was an unprecedented move in a criminal investigation. Over 5,000 men in the village and surrounding areas were asked to voluntarily submit blood samples for analysis. The goal was to match the semen found at the crime scenes to one of the men in the database. It was a daunting process, but the police knew that DNA profiling offered the best chance to identify the murderer. Among those who came forward to provide their DNA was Colin Pitchfork, a local man in his 30s who worked as a farm laborer. Pitchfork, a quiet and unassuming figure in the community, seemed like just another man eager to help the investigation. But beneath the surface, something far darker was at play. Pitchfork, knowing that his DNA could link him to the murders, had no intention of being caught. Instead, he came up with a devious plan to avoid giving his own DNA. Pitchfork persuaded Ian Kelly, a co-worker who knew him, to stand in for him. Kelly, unaware of the gravity of what he was being asked to do, was given a photo of Pitchfork to use as identification. Pitchfork convinced him to take the DNA test in his place, thus avoiding detection. It seemed like a brilliant scheme until Kelly, eager to impress his friends, boasted about the deception at a local pub. In a careless moment of bragging, Kelly casually revealed that he had taken the test on behalf of Pitchfork, inadvertently spilling the details of the scheme to others. This single slip-up would prove to be the key that unraveled the entire case. Word of Kelly's confession quickly spread, and police began to connect the dots. A few days later, Pitchfork was identified as the man who had masterminded the deception. He was arrested and taken in for questioning. Faced with mounting evidence, Pitchfork could no longer hide the truth. The breakthrough was monumental. When Pitchfork's DNA was finally compared to the semen samples found on both victims, the results were irrefutable. His DNA was a perfect match. For the first time, a man was caught not just through eyewitness testimony or circumstantial evidence, but through the genetic fingerprint that tied him directly to the crime scenes. Pitchfork's confession followed soon after. He admitted to the brutal murders of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, a shocking revelation that sent shockwaves through the community. His motives, though, remained unclear. His cold demeanor and lack of remorse left investigators wondering what kind of monster they had caught. But one thing was certain: the village of Narborough could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The killer was behind bars, and the power of DNA evidence had proven to be an unstoppable force in the pursuit of justice. The arrest of Colin Pitchfork was only the beginning of a dramatic turn in the case that had gripped the nation. The investigation that started with a brutal double murder had not only led to the capture of a killer, but also signaled a revolution in forensic science. Pitchfork's confession to the murders of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth was chilling, but it was the unprecedented use of DNA evidence that left an indelible mark on the case and the criminal justice system. In the wake of his arrest, Pitchfork was put on trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His DNA, found at both crime scenes, had been conclusively matched to the semen samples taken from the victims. It was the first time in history that DNA profiling had been used to convict someone of murder, and the implications were enormous. Forensic scientists and law enforcement officials were now armed with a powerful new tool that could be used to solve crimes in ways that had never been possible before. What had once been an elusive and underutilized technology had now proven its worth, not only in convicting the guilty, but in exonerating the innocent, as seen with Richard Buckland's wrongful involvement. During his trial, Pitchfork showed little emotion, his lack of remorse unsettling those who had followed the case. His motives remained unclear, and the stark coldness with which he confessed to the murders sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Many questioned what drove him to commit such heinous acts. Pitchfork had been a seemingly normal man, a father and a husband, yet he was capable of carrying out two brutal murders with a chilling detachment. Despite his confession, the emotional toll on the families of the victims was profound, and the trial only deepened the sorrow and anger felt by the community. In November 1988, Colin Pitchfork was found guilty of the murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth and was sentenced to life in prison. The judge described his actions as callous and savage. But even as he was handed his sentence, there was still a sense of unease. How many other cases might have gone unsolved without the breakthrough in forensic science? How many victims might have found justice sooner had DNA profiling been available? The case also had profound consequences beyond the immediate conviction of Pitchfork. It was a landmark moment in forensic science, highlighting the potential of DNA evidence as a tool for solving crimes. In the years that followed, DNA profiling would become a cornerstone of criminal investigations, helping to convict thousands of criminals and exonerate those wrongfully accused. The mass DNA screening used in the Pitchfork case became a model for future investigations, and forensic DNA databases were established around the world, creating an invaluable resource for law enforcement. Colin Pitchfork's conviction was not only the end of a long search for justice for the victims of Narborough, but also a turning point in the way criminal investigations were carried out. It was a reminder of the incredible power of science in the pursuit of truth and the importance of never giving up in the face of even the most challenging cases. As for Pitchfork, his life behind bars would be a reminder of how science, in the end, had caught up with him and brought justice to two innocent victims.